Hi, I'm Melissa. It began quietly the way most regrets do, not with a crash, but with a murmur, with something that seemed small and insignificant. At first, a simple message from someone I trusted, someone I had known for years, someone who had never given me a reason to doubt her. She told me about an opportunity, an investment that had helped her earn a decent return, and she wanted me to meet the person behind it. She made it sound casual, like a favor, like something I could explore and walk away from if it didn't feel right. He hesitated, not because I suspected anything, but because I always hesitated. I was careful, always had been. I made lists, I did research, I cross-checked everything. I didn't jump into things on a whim, but curiosity has a way of slipping past the gates. It doesn't knock, it just walks, and wearing a familiar face, I agreed to a video call. I told myself it couldn't hurt to listen. Introduced himself as Mark, a Belgian entrepreneur focused on sustainable energy projects and decentralized finance. He spoke with poise, his voice, even his posture, calculated, but not overtly so, just enough to feel polished. He talked about climate initiatives, about tokenizing investments to allow small investors like me to get involved in clean energy transitions. He showed me graphs, forecasts, business registration papers. Everything seemed in order, more than an order. It looked sophisticated. Over the next few days, I received documents from him via email, a detailed proposal, a signed agreement, an investment contract. It all looked professional, with terms clearly outlined. I forwarded the agreement to a friend of mine who worked in corporate law. He skimmed it and said it looked standard, clean, nothing suspicious. I kept telling myself this wasn't impulsive, this was deliberate, responsible. Considerity wired the funds at the end of the week, €3,000. It wasn't all I had, but it was enough to sting if it went wrong, enough to feel significant, enough to be real. I remember the way my hands felt cold even as I pressed the final confirmation on the banking app. My mind split into two halves, one reassuring, the other whispering warnings. Mark acknowledged receipt almost instantly. He said the project cycle would begin the following Monday. He explained the 30-day cycle, how the initial return would come, then followed by the principal after 90 days. I logged everything, created a folder on my computer titled Investment Green Future. Every document, every receipt, every screenshot went in there. Wanted to stay organized, to feel in control. The first week passed without worry, the second as well. I stayed busy, tried not to obsess. I told no one, not out of secrecy, but out of a desire to see it succeed. Before I shared, I imagined telling my parents how smart I had been, how I had made my money work for me, instead of letting it sit idle. When the third week arrived, I sent Mark a message asking how the cycle was progressing. He responded promptly, said everything was on track and that I would be notified when the return was ready to be distributed. I thanked him. I remember feeling grateful for how professional he was, always calm, always available, always reassuring. Then the 30 days came and went. There was no deposit. He checked my account multiple times that day, thinking maybe I had missed something, maybe it was processing, maybe it would show up overnight. Nathanji sent a polite message to Mark. He replied saying there had been a delay with the banking integration and that manual processing would now be required. He assured me it was being handled, said I would receive my funds within 70 to Horsey waited. 72 hours passed and still Nathanji wrote again. This time more direct, no response. Another day passed, another message, no reply. Silence was sudden and sharp, like a door slamming in the middle of a sentence. I checked the documents again, reread the emails, stared at the contract as if the ink might rearrange itself to reveal a hidden warning. He tried to call the mutual contact Sophie. Her number rang once, then voicemail. I sent her a message, no response. I tried again and again, then a third time her number stopped ringing altogether. I stared at my phone for what felt like hours, the dread curling slowly inward. Opened my laptop and began searching every forum, every scam report site, every place where victims whispered to each other in the dark, trying to piece together what had happened to them. I typed his name, Mark, Belgium, green energy investment. Nothing specific came up, but there were hints, mentions of similar methods, stories with enough resemblance to chill me to my core. That was the night I knew I had been scammed. It wasn't about instinct anymore, it was about fact. I pulled every piece of correspondence, saved it, categorized it, organized it. I renamed the folder from Green Future to Evidence. I filed a complaint with my bank. They expressed sympathy but told me since I had authorized the transfer. There was little they could do. They suggested I file a police report. I contacted the local authorities. The officer I spoke with was kind but honest. International cases, especially involving fraud, were difficult to prosecute unless large sums or multiple victims were involved. He took the report. I thanked him, but I left with no hope. Next, I contacted the Belgian Federal Police. I found an email on their official site, wrote a detailed account, attached every file, every image, every trace I had. I clicked send and stared at the screen until the cursor stopped blinking. Days passed with no reply. I sent it again, still silent. She returned to the forums, this time not just as a reader but as someone desperate to connect, to not feel alone. I shared my story anonymously. Someone responded they too had been approached by a Belgian investor. Same pitch, same name, same outcome. We compared notes, they matched perfectly. Then another person replied, and another. Soon there were 7 of us from different countries, different backgrounds, but all with the same wound. We created a private chat group, shared everything. We had messages, contracts, timelines. We built a composite profile of Mark, noted every alias, every bank account, every logo, every reused phrase. We compiled it all into a single document, a shared drive labeled simply the dossier. We submitted it again to the Belgian authorities, this time not as a single voice but as a chorus. We didn't expect a miracle, we just wanted acknowledgement, and this time we received it, a brief email confirming receipt stating our case had been forwarded to the appropriate division. Didn't celebrate, but we didn't give up either. We continued searching, tracing digital footprints, connecting dots that should have never existed. The group became a strange kind of support system, a place where the weight of betrayal was shared and lessened. Somewhere in that process, something shifted in me. I stopped thinking like a victim. I started thinking like an investigator, like someone who had been wronged and would not let it fade into silence. I still didn't know if we would win, if the money would ever be returned, or if Mark would ever face consequence, but I knew one thing for certain: he had taken something from me, and I was not going to let him keep it quietly, not now, not ever. In the weeks that followed the confirmation from Belgian authorities, I sank into a world that felt unfamiliar and yet frighteningly easy to understand. Once I had crossed the threshold, the logic of obsession replaced the rhythm of my old life. I began waking up not with a to-do list for work or a plan for the day, but with questions, cold, mechanical questions. Where else had his name appeared? Which email addresses could be traced? What other names had he used? How many others were out there? Walking through the same fog. The group we had formed grew quickly. What began as 7 of us soon became 10, then 12, then 15. Word of our digital vigil spread through forums, private threads, Telegram channels, whispers traveling through the alleyways of the internet. Each new arrival brought their own trail of pain, some with screenshots, others with bank receipts. One woman had been persuaded to invest over €10,000. Another had introduced Mark to her cousin, who then lost twice that amount. The stories were all different, but all the same. They all started with charm and ended with silence. We built a spreadsheet, a living map of deceit, every entry added, carefully cross-referenced, tracked. We created tabs for aliases, domains, phone numbers, bank details, LinkedIn profiles, WhatsApp screenshots. Everything that had a scent of him was logged. We knew that names could be faked, documents forged, but patterns could not be erased. They left a residue, and that residue told us a story. Mark was not just one man, he was many, or rather, he wore many skins. Sometimes he was Mark, sometimes Lucien, sometimes Jerome. In one set of documents, he appeared as Matthew D. Wild, founder of Econova BV in Ghent, a shell company that borrowed branding from the materials he had sent me. I stared at that logo for hours. The same green leaf, the same stylized sun, the same font as the fake proposal I had reviewed weeks earlier. The realization that it had been used before, that I was not the first to see it, made my stomach turn. Wade traced the Econova name through Belgian business registries using Google Translate to fumble through Dutch records. There was an address attached, a small office block on the edge of Ghent. We passed it around the group. One of our members, Daniel, a software engineer living in Antwerp, volunteered to visit. He drove out on a gray Sunday morning, took photos of the building. It was real, but the name Econova was not listed on the buzzer. No plaque, no logo, no Daniel spoke with a nearby shopkeeper who confirmed that a man matching Mark's photo had rented a space there under the name Julian. He had moved out 2 months earlier, left no forwarding address. Julian, a thread name. Another thread we added it to the list. The group had become a digital war room. We held Zoom calls at odd hours coordinated across time zones. We shared updates, leads, suspicions. We built a repository, a collection of everything we had found. There were diagrams, timelines, link maps. It looked like something from a true crime documentary, but it wasn't fiction. It was our life. Somewhere during this process, I realized I had not left my apartment in 3 days. I lived in sweatpants surrounded by open tabs, cold coffee cups, unread books. My phone was always within reach, my notifications turned on for every group update. I slept with my laptop on the nightstand and woke up to its glow. It didn't feel unhealthy, it felt necessary, like holding your breath while swimming through deep water. Knowing that the surface was still far away, began to reach out to journalists, ones who had written about fraud, investment scams, crypto grifts. I crafted a short pitch, not for publication but for awareness, a warning. I attached anonymized case files, a statement from our group, a plea for visibility. A few responded, some asked questions, others ignored us, but one journalist from a Dutch finance magazine agreed to an interview. She spoke with me for over an hour. I told her everything from the first message to the last unanswered email. She listened, she asked follow-ups, and then she published a headline read The Disappearing Investor, How a Belgian Visionary Scammed Victims Across Europe. It wasn't front page news, but it was something people began to notice in quiet corners of the web. Few Reddit threads, a mention on a podcast. Someone claimed they had seen Mark at a blockchain conference in Lisbon 2 years ago under yet another name. One of our newer members, Elise, recognized the alias from a WhatsApp exchange she had had with him. She forwarded it to me, and I felt the chill return. Was always one step ahead, always adapting, shifting, hiding like smoke through fingers. But now we were chasing him as a pack, and smoke does not travel far without a windowed evening. While trawling an obscure crypto developer forum, I found a post by a user named SolarEdge92 asking for advice on offshore wallets and tax strategies for green startups. The language was familiar, too polished, too rehearsed. I read it 5 times and then sent it to Anna, who confirmed it matched the tone from her emails with Mark. She was certain it was him. There was an email address attached, encrypted, disposable. I created a new identity, built a cover story, a new name, Isabel, a small investor from London with family backing looking to support sustainable tech. I sent a message from a fresh Proton Mail account saying I had seen his post and wanted to hear. Marek replied the next morning, said his name was Julian and that he was based in Belgium and occasionally traveled for meetings. He attached a PDF proposal, opened it, and stared at the screen. Same structure, same promises, new logo, same Lee printed. It annotated it line by line. I forwarded it to the group. We added it to the archive. I sent it to the authorities, flagged the matching details, documented the reused materials. This was not just circumstantial, this was a pattern, this was proof. And then I sat there and watched the cursor blink on the screen, unsure of what to do next, because I knew something had changed. I was no longer just following, I was leading. I had drawn him in without him knowing, and now I stood at a crossroads. Do I reveal myself? Do I try to meet him? Do I take the next step? He closed the laptop and stood by the window. Night had fallen and the street below was quiet. A few headlights passed, strangers living their lives untouched by the labyrinth I had walked into. I felt the weight of all the names, all the stories, all the hope that justice might be possible. Then I remembered what it felt like that first night when I knew I had been scammed. The cold, the silence, the shame. Thought of the others, of the ones who still hadn't come forward, of the ones too ashamed to speak up. We owed it to them. We would not stop, not until every name was known. After I sent the proposal to the authorities and filed it away in the archive, I knew there was only one path forward, and it terrified me, not because I feared what might happen, but because of how calm I felt about it, how methodical and clear everything had become, as if the panic and confusion of those early days had hardened into something sharper, more precise, a focus born not from hope but necessity. I spent the next 48 hours building my cover story brick by brick. I refined my emails, Updated my fake investor profile filled in fabricated portfolios, crafted bios so bland they looked real. I chose a profile picture that had been used 100 times before. License-free corporate headshot, no history, no trace. I built social media accounts from scratch, kept them sparse but convincing, everything designed to be just credible enough to pass a casual check and too dull to invite questions. Then I waited. Julian responded quickly, said he appreciated my interest, said he had availability for a call in the coming week. He offered a few time slots. I selected one, not too eager, not too distant. I pretended to be interested but cautious. I thanked him for his flexibility, told him I would come prepared. In the days leading up to the call, I rehearsed every moment. I prepared questions I knew would not give away who I really was. I practiced my posture, facial expressions, voice tone in the mirror, trying to erase any trace of Melissa from my face so that when the screen lit up, I would not flinch. I would not let recognition touch the edges of my expression. I would not tremble. Morning of the meeting, I woke early. I reviewed everything again, the notes, the script, the background I would be calling from. I checked my microphone, my lighting, my fake Zoom name, and waited until the exact moment the link appeared. When the call connected, there he was, marked different, name different, setting different, clothes but the same man. My pulse quickened but my face did not. Began to speak and I listened, recorded, took notes, cataloged every recycled phrase, every reused projection, every recycled leaf. Talked about infrastructure, scalability, eco-incentives, regulatory partnerships. He described token systems and investment caps and predicted timeframes. He mentioned banks and incubators and partners whose names I would later discover were either exaggerated or entirely fabricated. But I listened to it all and pretended to nod at the right times. I murmured small acknowledgments and noted the new IBAN number at the bottom of his pitch document. I kept the recording going as he wrapped up the presentation and offered to answer any questions. I said I would review everything with my silent partners and get back to him. He smiled, thanked me for my time, and the screen went dark. He sat there for a long time afterwards, staring at the stillness, the echo of his voice still bouncing in the corners of my apartment. The quiet that followed felt heavier than the conversation itself. I had spoken to the man who had taken my money, who had vanished into names and faces and promises, and now I had proof. I had clarity. Sent the video to the group, flagged the key moments, timestamped the proposals, attached the metadata, added it all to the master archive. Now had visual confirmation, a direct engagement, another name to tie back to the same voice, the same scammy. Filed an updated report with the Belgian police, forwarded the video with annotations, included our ongoing data from new victims and aliases. I contacted the journalist from the Dutch magazine and sent her a summary of our findings to date. She responded with 3 words: keep going, Melisabeth. Even with the video, even with the growing mountain of evidence, I knew it would not be enough to stop him. Not yet. Not. Alane proposed to the group that we create a central site, a digital graveyard of the scam, something public, something permanent, a searchable archive of names, documents, tactics, patterns, a warning system for the next person who received a message like the one I had months ago. Debated the risks and the ethics of it, but the consensus was clear. The authorities were moving slowly and silence had always been his ally, so we chose noise. We chose light. He began designing the site. Basic structure, minimal design, nothing flashy, just facts, just names, dates, aliases, documents annotated with precision. We called it the Ledger, and within a week it was live. We shared it quietly, first on victim support boards, crypto scam forums, investigative subreddits, and then slowly wider, and people began to find us. More messages, more stories, more people who had lost money, who had been approached, who had narrowly escaped. It became a growing ledger of pain but also of warning, of witness. It was not justice, but it was momentum. And yet, even as the circle widened, I felt the center shift inside me. The line between vigilance and obsession blurred. My waking thoughts were filled with new angles, new searches, late-night trawls through domain registration logs, server traces, metadata analysis. I began seeing patterns in everything, hearing his cadence in unrelated interviews, imagining his pitch in the voices of strangers. Me friends stopped calling. I stopped answering, my work began to slip, I missed meetings, forgot emails, meals I could not taste, my world had narrowed to a single task: expose him, end this, finish Ito night. I woke at 3 a.m. from a dream I could not remember, drenched in sweat. I sat at my desk and reopened my tabs, 100 windows open, blinking lines of data, numbers, aliases, image files. I stared at them until my eyes burned, until they blurred into nonsense, until I realized I no longer knew what I was looking for, only that I could not stop. He stood and walked to the bathroom, splashed water on my face, stared at the stranger in the mirror, and whispered that I was still here, that I was not lost. And I returned to my desk because I was not done, because I could not be done, because somewhere out there he was still moving, still speaking, still spinning the next lee, and I was still listening. When the days began to stretch into weeks and the investigation took on a momentum I could no longer control, I started to feel the dissonance between what the world saw and what I was becoming. It was subtle at first, a forgotten call here, a late reply there, then it grew sharper, more pronounced, like I was a ghost haunting my own life, while the core of my existence pulsed quietly behind screens and quiet files and messages from strangers who all carried the same wound, no longer made small talk with colleagues. My work performance began to drift, but I didn't care, because my true work lived elsewhere, in the endless sifting of logs, the updates from the group, the slow march toward identifying the man behind the curtain, not just the alias, not just the voice, but the real person, the one who lived and breathed and planned this, not in fiction but in the same world I walked in. Began mapping every confirmed contact to a timeline, printing it out on my wall like some detective in a crime thriller, pushpins, threads crossing city to city, pattern to pattern. It helped me visualize how far his reach extended and how often he had repeated the scam with no visible hesitation, with no fear of being discovered, like it was all just business, the cold sort of business that builds walls between action and consequence. One day I received a message from someone new. He had not been scammed, but he had been approached with a proposal and had searched the company name out of skepticism and found our site. The ledger. He thanked me, said the warnings likely saved him thousands. That small message shook something in me. I sat quietly after reading it, realizing for the first time that this pursuit was no longer about healing. It was about impact, about not letting silence be the only response left. But there was a cost, and I was paying it piece by piece. My sleep became irregular, thin, restless. I would wake with images of contracts and screen captures still echoing behind my eyes. I lost interest in food and friends in daylight. I would go days without stepping outside my apartment, growing increasingly tethered to the glow of digital light, as if the sun no longer mattered. Me parents called, I ignored it. My sister sent messages, I read them but didn't reply. What would I say? That I was too busy building a case against a man no one believed existed, that I was sinking into a role I had invented out of loss, out of fury. I couldn't explain that, so I didn't. Tracked a new alias. It had appeared twice, once in a document submitted by someone in Norway and again in a message forwarded from an investor in Romania. It was close to his previous identities but altered just enough to slip past casual scrutiny. I flagged it to the group. We added it to the dossier. It felt like stacking sandbags against a rising tide. Then one evening, while reviewing an old trail of WhatsApp messages, I found something buried, a casual comment about a cafe in Bruges, a throwaway line, a personal detail, the first one I had ever seen repeated from another source. Someone else had mentioned it weeks ago when recounting their video call with him. It clicked, and I felt my heart start to race. I traced every mention of Bruges in the chat history, triangulated timestamps, and found a window of consistency. He had been there at least 3 times between 2021 and now, possibly more. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was enough to focus. He booked a flight. It was impulsive but not irrational. I needed to see the place to feel what it meant to chase something physical again. I packed light, brought printed files on encrypted USB drives, kept my real identity hidden, traveled under a neutral name I used for investigations, not Melissa, not Isabel, something quieter, something cleansed. Streets of Bruges were quiet, cobbled, and ancient, but alive with the kind of rhythm you only feel when you're walking alone with intent. I wandered for hours, revisiting the list of cafes mentioned, cross-referencing every street name with open registries and cross-traffic cams and foot traffic data. It was obsessive, meticulous, and slow, but on the third day I found I'd a small calf just off a canal, nondescript enough to forget, and yet somehow etched into memory. I stepped inside and ordered coffee, sat by the window and watched. I didn't expect him to walk in. I wasn't chasing a miracle, but I wanted to be in a place he had been, to feel the weight of what he had walked past while weaving lies through wires and screens. There was a photograph on the wall, a community event from 2 years ago, blurred faces, rows of smiles. One man near the edge caught my attention. My breath caught, not because it was definitely him, but because it could have been, and even that possibility electrified me with a strange kind of validation. I asked the barista about the photo. She said it was a local business networking night taken before the renovations. She didn't know many of the people in it. Most were travelers or expats. She said he took a picture of the photo, sent it to the group. Daniel enhanced it as much as he could. It was inconclusive, but it reignited the energy we had been losing. The slow erosion of hope had paused for a moment. We had something to hold. Again, that night in my hotel room, I sat by the window looking out over the canal. Lights reflected like soft lines of fire on the water. I thought about everything that had happened since that first email, since that first video call, since the silence that had followed. I realized I no longer cared about the money, not in the way I used to. It was no longer about restitution or even justice. It was about seeing him stopped, about preventing the echo of his actions from finding new ears to whisper toned. I realized I would not stop until that happened, even if it meant never fully returning to who I had been, because that woman was gone and in her place stood someone new, Mion, who had stared into the hollow room of deceit and refused to walk away. When I returned from Bruges, I felt something had shifted, like a current pulling me deeper than I had planned. The photo, the streets, the coffee shop, they were all fragments, pieces of a larger puzzle I could almost see but not yet touch. My days became stricter, my routines sharper. I began to prepare not just as an investigator but as someone laying a trap, and for the first time I felt like I was no longer following him but circling in closer. I knew he would not stop. I knew his pattern too well now, the rhythm of his fraud, the timeline he followed, the language he used, the investment cycle he pretended to manage. It had a structure, and all structures could be timed, measured, mapped, and intercepted. He was always seeking new targets, always recruiting, always evolving aliases but not methods, and that was his weakness. He worked with a group to create decoy profiles, carefully tailored investor personas that we slowly fed into niche forums and invitation-only platforms, the kind he frequented. They were designed to be exactly the sort of bait he could not resist. Modest investors, international, passive, low profile, eager for guidance. We attached fake names, credentials polished but not flashy enough to provoke a pitch from him, and waited. We used our knowledge to steer conversations toward the topics he typically responded to: climate, tech, blockchain, micro investment programs, digital sustainability, credits, each word a signal carefully chosen to mirror his vocabulary. Like speaking a dialect designed to make him lean forward. It took 4 days before one of our baits was contacted by someone going by the name Thomas, a new identity, but the same message, same offer, same promises. We confirmed the writing style, the structure of the pitch, the digital watermark on the PDF he attached matched one he had used with Anna 2 months earlier. Our system flagged it instantly. We had him again. This time I wanted to escalate. I didn't just want another recorded call or another reused contract. I wanted a physical meeting, a location, a traceable footprint. I proposed to the group that we use one of the decoy investors to request an in-person consultation, someone close enough to his current region, based in Paris with interest in Brussels. The team agreed. We crafted the backstory carefully. We set expectations and proposed an in-person review of the pitch. Agreed within 24 hours. Offered a neutral location, a co-working lounge near the city center. Quiet, professional, unassuming. We researched the location, confirmed its existence, verified their booking policies. It was public enough to be safe but private enough for surveillance. Who contacted a Belgian private investigator, one of the group members had worked with before. We explained everything, provided the documents, proof, names, screenshots, timeline. We asked for discreet observation during the meeting, not interference, just presence. The investigator agreed, and preparations. Wersetti was the one who would go. I knew it was risky, but I also knew it had to be me. I had followed him the longest, seen the most faces of his deceit, and I could recognize what others might miss. I dyed my hair, wore subtle makeup, changed my walk, my voice. I dressed like someone different, someone generic, someone who might get lost in a crowd. I traveled light, carried a small notebook, fake contracts, a burner phone, nothing that could betray who I really was. Morning of the meeting, I arrived early, sat near the window in the corner of the lounge. The investigator was nearby, seated with a newspaper, discreetly watching. I set out a small folder, pretended to review documents, kept my breathing slow even as my pulse counted every second, and then he walked in. It was him, no doubt, in my mind, dressed in muted tones, carrying a slim briefcase. He scanned the room, then spotted me and walked over. I stood to greet him, nodded, said my fake name, and we shook hands. His grip was light, practiced. He had done this many times before. We sat, and he began his pitch, the same cadence, the same charts he placed on the table, the same practice, passion for green technologies and decentralization. I let him speak uninterrupted, watching his eyes, his movements, his hands, taking mental snapshots of everything. After 20 minutes, I interrupted, told him I needed to verify some numbers with a partner, and excused myself to the restroom. Once there, I sent a coded message to the investigator confirming it was him. He acknowledged and signaled to begin observation. As Mark left the Boldingi, returned to the table, finished the meeting with polite words, took the documents he offered, shook his hand again, and left through a different exit. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. I had what I came forth at night, back in my hotel, uploaded everything, the video footage, the audio, the physical documents, scans, the photo of him seated across from me, hands on his charts, voice smooth and certain. We cross-referenced the footage with prior records. It was a perfect match. We compiled it all into a comprehensive file, sent it to Belgian authorities, marked urgent, updated case report, digital forensics, verified identity, confirmed video and physical contact, established multiple international victims, named jurisdictional relevance, highlighted. Then we waited. 2 days later, we received confirmation from the Cybercrime Division acknowledging receipt of the updated evidence and informing us the case had been escalated to prosecutorial review pending further action. It was not justice yet, but it was closer than we had ever been, and for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to sleep, not because it was over, but because the trap had closed, and now the silence belonged to him. The days that followed moved slowly, not because they were uneventful, but because I watched them unfold from a place of cautious hope, like standing behind glass watching a storm build beyond your reach. We had done everything we could. Every document, every recording, every digital trace had been handed over, every piece meticulously catalogued and packaged in a dossier so complete that it felt less like evidence and more like a confession carved out of silence. But the waiting was brutal. Time did not pass. It bled, stretched into something soft and shapeless. I checked my email obsessively, refreshed our internal group chat every hour, reread the final message from the Belgian cybercrime unit until it lost meaning, each word dissected for signs of urgency or finality. I told myself to be patient, but my nerves refused to listen, so I worked. I went deeper than I ever had into his web. I no longer cared if I found something actionable. I just needed to keep moving, like a shark desperate not to drown in stillness. I opened old databases, trawled company registries, financial records, corporate filings, all connected loosely to the network of aliases he had used, and like weeds beneath stones, I found Moret had created a new identity. A week before our in-person meeting, under the name Dirk Halberg, tied to a firm called Solvra Greentech, listed as based in Luxembourg, the company website was minimal, nearly empty, except for a single page claiming development of blockchain-based ecological credits. It was filled with the same language he always used: sustainable, equitable, forward-thinking, all lies dressed as innovationi. Traced the domain registration to a third-party proxy service, but the hosting IP matched 2 prior companies. we had already tied to him. It was enough we flagged it, added it to the ledger, documented every image, line of code, and metadata fragment. There was no doubt it was him. We also found a new pattern, not in the data but in the victims for the first time. We had reached people who had not lost money yet only time, trust, belief. They had spoken to him, attended his webinars, received his proposals, but hadn't yet sent a wire. They were angry too, not for what they had lost, but for how close they had come. We began collecting those stories as well, and they became a second file, a different kind of ledger, not just a record of harm, but a list of those we had saved. Night, I received a message from a contact in the cybersecurity community, someone who had been following our updates quietly from the sidelines. He said he had located a server cluster tied to a known crypto laundering ring, and that Mark's alias had been found among a list of client usernames encrypted but with partial identifiers that matched accounts we had flagged weeks earlier. He asked how sure he was. He said 90%, and Rasinji didn't sleep that night. Instead, I compiled everything into a new folder labeled Solvra Leak and began a timeline showing how this new identity overlapped with older ones, the way he reused emails, rebranded, recycled strategies, and never covered his tracks completely. Not when he was moving fast, not when he was feeding the scam. We pushed this new report to the authorities, and this time we received a reply in less than 24 hours, a direct acknowledgement from a senior investigator thanking us for the new data, confirming that it aligned with their ongoing inquiry and requesting a follow-up call. I stared at the message for a long time, not quite believing it. We scheduled the call for the following afternoon, and when it came, the tone was different, more focused, more serious, more detailed. They asked for technical clarifications about timestamps, file origins, blockchain wallet relationships. I answered every question with precision, then handed it over to Daniel and Anna, who filled in gaps I hadn't even known were there. At the end of the call, the officer said something I still remember clearly: "This is no longer just a report, you're now part of an open cassette." Wasn't closure, but it was recognition. I allowed myself a moment, a breath, a pause. We updated the rest of the group, and the relief was like rain on dry ground. For the first time in months, we felt seen, not just by each other, but by someone with the power to act. The case had moved from inbox to desk, from desk to file, from file to courtroom door, and that mattered. The next days were a flurry of follow-ups and confirmations. We provided historical context, digital chain of custody for every piece of evidence, notarized witness summaries from victims, sworn statements where needed. It felt less like telling a story and more like closing one, like walking back through a haunted house with the lights. Oni started to leave my apartment again, walked unfamiliar streets, sad and calf-esque, not because I was searching, but because I had stopped hiding. The world felt wider again, not safer, but less narrow. The air moved differently, and I let Itone. Afternoon, while sitting in a park reading a book I hadn't touched in weeks, my phone buzzed. A message from Sophie, the same person who had introduced me to Mark months ago, the one who had vanished during the unraveling, the one I had tried to reach again and again. It simply, "Sadie saw the site. I didn't know. I'm sorry." And I believed Harry didn't reply. Not then, not yet, but I saved the message and stared at it for a long time because it reminded me that while lies travel fast sometimes, the truth takes a longer road, but it gets there eventually. The weeks that followed were unlike anything that had come before, not because the pace changed or the danger faded, but because the storm that once roared had shifted to something quieter, more precise, more inevitable. There was no announcement, no grand reveal, only the feeling of movement beneath the surface, like tectonic plates shifting far below the noise of the world. The authorities had what they needed, but investigations are slow, deliberate machines designed not for speed but permanence. And while they worked through their channels, I turned inward again, not to retreat, but to understand what had happened, not just around me, but within my. Began to write, not reports, not timelines, not emails, but thoughts, pieces of memory, the emotional wreckage that still clung to me, the disorientation, the humiliation, the white-hot shame that had lived under my skin since the beginning. I didn't write for publication. I wrote because if I didn't, the weight of it would remain unspoken, buried and I was tired of burying things. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night and reach for my notebook, my handwriting chaotic and half-formed, trying to catch a thought before it disappeared like smoke. The words were not about him, not directly, but about the shadow he had left behind, the questions that would never be fully answered, the pieces of myself I still didn't know how to reassemble. Watch the group evolve. Two people began to drift, not in betrayal but in healing. They returned to their lives slowly, carefully. One member went back to teaching, another rejoined a startup, a few started advocacy work using our story to warn others, and I watched them go, not with sadness but with pride. We had built something together, not just a case but a bridge, something to cross the impossible. Daniel and I kept in touch more than the others, sometimes daily, not because we needed to, but because we had built something stronger than the crime that connected us. We had seen the same darkness and chosen not to look away. That mattered more than I could ever say. On evening, I sat at the window of my apartment, the same apartment that had once felt like a prison, and watched the city breathe below me. I saw people laughing, cars passing, lights blinking in distant towers, and I realized I was no longer searching for him. In every facade was still out there, of that I had no doubt, but he was no longer invisible, and that changed everything. The walls that once protected him had cracks, and through those cracks truth had poured in piece by piece until it began to drown. The leaf final report from the cybercrime unit arrived a week later, confirming formal charges had been filed under his primary alias and 3 others, all connected to documented scams totaling hundreds of thousands of euros. It wasn't the end, but it was the moment. The story turned from rumor to record, from trauma to justice. They didn't need me to testify, not yet, but they asked for a final sworn statement to complete their case file. I sat down that night and wrote it, not like the others. This time, I included the things I had never written before, the fear, the self-doubt, the way my voice shook. The day I realized I'd been fooled, I told the truth. Not just about him, but about myself. I sent it and closed the document without rereading it. It was enough. It was done. I walked to the park the next morning, the air cool and quiet, and sat under the same tree where Sophie's message had reached me weeks earlier. I opened my phone and typed a reply: "Thank you for telling Methan." I turned off my notifications and let the silence return, not as something to fear, but as something I had earned it, because silence had once been his weapon, but now it was many a place to rest, a place to rebuild, a place to begin again. I never expected justice to feel quiet. I thought it would arrive like thunder, like sirens or headlines or the clamor of doors finally opened, but instead it came softly, like the slow return of warmth after winter, or the hush that follows a long-held breath. It came not with triumph, but with peace, not with a verdict, but with the decision to move forward. In the weeks after the charges became public, I stayed offline more often. I walked without a destination, visited bookstores, lingered in cafes, wrote in margins, and read things that had nothing to do with fraud or deception or law. I gave myself permission to forget for a little while, not out of denial, but out of mercy. Group dissolved gradually like mist after sunrise. We didn't make a show of goodbyes, we just let go when the time felt right. A few of us still exchanged occasional notes, but the daily intensity was gone, replaced by something softer, a mutual understanding that we had walked through something impossible together. And Survivati thought about writing our story in full, the whole arc from first contact to final report, but every time I sat down to begin, I paused, because to write it now felt like claiming something I didn't own. This wasn't just my story. It was 100 stories braided together, each one echoing the same wound, the same awakening, the same slow path to healing. And yet, I still wrote, not to share, but to remember, not to relive, but to acknowledge that all of it happened, that I had been one person before, and now I was another, not better, not worse, just changed, more aware, more deliberate, more anchored in the truth. And even the most careful person can be fooled, and even the most broken person can rebuild. On morning, I woke early, before the sun rose, and walked to the harbor. The air was crisp, the world still asleep. I stood at the edge of the water and watched the first light spill across the sky, slow, golden, steady, no fanfare, just presence. And I thought about the girl I had been at the beginning scared, angry, humiliated, lost, and how far she had come without realizing she didn't need revenge, not anymore. I didn't need an apology or explanation. I didn't need to see his face in court or hear his voice crack under cross-examination. What I needed was hear the stillness, the sunrise, the quiet knowledge that he no longer had power over my days or my name or my voice. I breathed deeply and let the cold air settle into my lungs, clean and sharp and full of promise. When I walked back home, I passed a small bookstore with a hand-lettered sign in the window. It said, "Healing is a story you write in silence." I smiled, not because it was profound, but because it was a now, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was too. Thank you for listening to my story with me. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video for more scam stories.